So first, I want to start by thanking Long Chen and the Luohan Academy for convening this meeting. I want to thank them and Regina for inviting me to participate in today's event. You know, when I was first asked to join this meeting on diversity, my inclination was, I don't really know much about it because, like Kathy, my impression of diversity at the time was, oh, you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. That's a buzz phrase that has made a lot of rounds in academic circles, particularly at MIT, where we've had a lot of controversy about the so-called cancel culture, where speakers have been canceled because of certain things that they said that other people don't agree with. And so there's a concern among academics about the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as a financial economist, I'm not an expert in that issue. So my first reaction to Regina's kind invitation was, thanks, but I don't really think I have much to say about DEI. And then I get an email from Simon, who I realize is really behind this meeting. And as soon as I know that Simon is involved and other colleagues of his, like Scott Page and Josh Plotkin and Martin Reeves, many of whom have inspired my own thinking in this area, I thought, okay, well, now that makes sense. So what I thought I would do in my 15 minutes is to focus on the role of diversity in financial markets, since that's the area that I focus on. I don't know how many of you can see my little square, but if it's small, you may want to use the pin function, or Regina, you can spotlight my image so you can see the screen.
It's good, Andy.
Okay, great. So I want to start with an observation, which is that typically when people use terms borrowed from evolutionary biology and ecology, things like mutation, innovation, selection, and so on, they're using it metaphorically. And so the notion that all the world's a stage by Shakespeare, or that hedge funds are the Galapagos Islands of finance, those are metaphors. But I want to argue that the idea of evolution in finance is not metaphorical. It's literal. Literal in the sense that biological processes are one mechanism by which selection affects population characteristics, but financial evolution, the interaction between money, markets, and financial decisions, is a different mechanism by which selection also affects population characteristics, albeit survival of the richest, not necessarily the fittest in the biological context. And so the point is that when we talk about evolution in financial markets, it's important to understand that this is not just some kind of qualitative discussion. It's really applying the principles of natural selection or financial selection to market dynamics. In both cases, both biological and financial selection, you're trying to model the impact of selection on the population, even though the mechanisms are different. So obviously the propagation of characteristics, of traits, in biology is through genetic mechanisms. Those mechanisms are different in financial selection, but nonetheless, there is an evolutionary process going on that we can understand. And so in this book that I published a few years ago on adaptive markets, I applied the principles of evolutionary biology and ecology to financial contexts. And in these 5 basic principles, you can actually see evolution at work, albeit a different type of evolution. And I'm going to just go through a couple of examples. So I want to turn to this notion of diversity in adaptive markets. We've already heard from the first session and from Kathy's comments about what we mean by diversity. Certainly from a financial perspective, the notion of diversification is really hardwired into virtually everything that we study. But I think that diversity has a broader set of meanings in financial markets that would be useful to consider. And so I want to focus on the idea of why diversity is so important. We know from Aristotle that nature abhors a vacuum. And I think by that same token, I've written in a number of contexts that nature also abhors an undiversified bet. Now, this is counter to a number of investment principles that particularly venture capitalists focus on. Warren Buffett has famously dismissed the notion of diversification by pointing out that instead of not putting all your eggs in one basket, he prefers to put all his eggs in one basket and then watch that basket very carefully. Now, if you're Warren Buffett and you're really good at watching, eggs in baskets, maybe you don't have to worry about diversification. But for the rest of us, diversification is actually a very powerful principle. And in nature, an undiversified bet, meaning traits that are really focused on a very narrow set of environmental conditions, is a recipe for disaster because, as we know, the environment is stochastic. And when those environmental challenges change, if we are not diversified, we risk extinction. A good example of that is what all of us lived through over the past 2 years with COVID-19. We've been saved by the vaccines that several companies, particularly Moderna and Pfizer and BioNTech, have developed. It's kind of sobering to realize that BioNTech and Moderna did not exist as companies 20 years ago. Think about that. It's within the last 20 years that the two companies that saved our society, that developed these vaccines, that saved us in the past 2 years, they did not exist 2 decades ago. And so I would say that we escaped a much, much greater disaster in the pandemic by the skin of our teeth, thanks to the diversity of the biotechnology industry. So the question that I want to put to you is, what if we studied finance the way that ecologists study their particular environments? What if we looked at, say, the financial crisis, and instead of focusing on it from the typical financial theory or financial empirical analysis, suppose instead we focused on the financial crisis from an ecological perspective and do what ecologists do, which is to study the flora, the fauna, to measure the biomass of various keystone species and ask what the predator and prey relationships are in that context. So I want to give you an example of this. I want to focus on one very specific issue surrounding the financial crisis and look at the financial economics as well as the ecology of this particular challenge. And that has to do with the so-called too big to fail phenomenon. I'm going to start with an example of Bank of America. This is a US bank that a number of us do business with. I think many people on this call from the US have accounts at Bank of America. And I want to take you back to 2008, when the Bank of America got overextended and had to be bailed out by the US government. You may not remember this because it's a while ago, but in the fall of 2008, Bank of America required a $25 billion capital injection by the US government in order to stave off insolvency and ultimately a failure of the bank. Fall of 2008, we had to inject $25 billion into this institution. January of 2009, we had to add an additional $20 billion to Bank of America, plus a $118 billion guarantee on their balance sheet. And in March of 2009, we added another $5.2 billion by bailing out AIG that was supposed to provide a $5.2 billion payout to Bank of America because of some credit default swaps. So it was pretty clear throughout the financial crisis that Bank of America, along with a number of other institutions, were systemically important and were too big to fail. We could not let this particular institution fail. So you would think that we learned our lesson, didn't we? We learned our lesson back in 2008, and we have since made sure that there aren't such single points of failure. We decided that we need to have more diversity in the financial system, right? Well, let's take a look at it. In 2005, well before the financial crisis occurred, how big was Bank of America? And these are some numbers that you might be familiar with, those of you who are economists that study banking. In 2005, 3 years before this financial crisis, The total revenues of Bank of America was about $57 billion. Their assets were about $1.3 trillion. The size of their loans and leases, about $500 billion. They had about 600 million in deposits. And in terms of total headcount, they had about 176,000 people employed in this one institution. Okay, so that was 2005. So naturally, since then, we've corrected the problem, right? So that Bank of America is now no longer too big to fail. So let's take a look at just how big Bank of America is. If we actually look at their size as of 2000, whoops, sorry, get this out of the way. If we look at their size as of 2021, their total revenues are nearly double. Their total assets are more than double. If you look at their loans and lease, that's also about double. Their deposits are close to 4 times the size of 2005, and they've increased their headcount as well. Now, these are in 2021 dollars. If you convert that to 2005 dollars, you can see that in every single category, Bank of America is even bigger than it was. So if you thought this bank was too big to fail, well, it's even bigger now. And if we now go to a paper that was published in 2006 by Helen Janicki and Ed Prescott through the Richmond Fed, they actually did a study of the concentration problem in the banking industry from 1960 to 2005. And both by measure of the number of independent banks, as well as the market share of the 10 largest banks, this too big to fail problem has been going on for decades, and it continues. If you would update these graphs to today, you would see that the problem has gotten worse. And so the question about why there is this loss in diversity, why we have such concentration, is a serious problem. I'm not going to tell you the answer. For economists, I think we've figured out the answer. But the larger issue is why we haven't done anything about it. And this is why we need to study these issues from an ecological perspective. If we approach this as an ecologist might, by cataloging the flora and fauna of the financial system, by documenting the keystone species, the symbiotic relationships among the various different species, and understanding exactly what the relationships are, it actually becomes clear why it is that these institutions are too big to fail and continue to grow. If we then measure the foraging behavior of these species, the environmental pressures, and the adaptive responses, we can then begin to craft policy to address these issues. The current policies clearly aren't working, and so the loss of diversity is something that we really have to be concerned about. Finally, by asking what the role of size is in financial institutions, and a number of both economists as well as ecologists and evolutionary biologists, including Martin, Simon, Scott, Josh, and others, if we try to understand the role of size in this particular ecosystem, and there is an example, one of Simon's colleagues, John Bonner, published a book years ago on why size matters in biology. I think we can begin to think about what to do about it. So a number of speakers have already talked about the fact that diversity brings us robustness, resilience, sustainability, and longevity. And so in some work that Simon and I have done, both on thinking about financial regulation from an evolutionary perspective, and in a recent PNAS volume on applying evolutionary models to financial markets, I think there are clear answers on what we can do to promote diversity in the financial system and to measure it, to therefore be able to manage it. And I look forward to the conversations with all of the participants at this meeting, because I think that we really need to have this multidisciplinary approach to this extraordinarily complex and adaptive system. Thank you.